cold cave air, damp stone, and the scratch of sand under a tired sandal. That is where this message meets you, because some of you were told that if heaven marked your life, the road would turn soft. David proves the opposite. The oil can touch your head, and the night can still close in around you. You can be chosen and still feel the chill of rock at your back. They thought a cave meant delay, but for the one God has set apart, a cave can become a courtroom where every lie spoken over your life starts to collapse. And that is why this story matters to you, not because it begins on a throne, but because it begins in hiding, with breath echoing off stone walls, with hunted footsteps, with the smell of earth and old fire lingering in the dark. The hidden adversaries around him believed that if they pushed him far enough from the palace, far enough from comfort, far enough from witnesses, the promise on his life would dry up on its own. But they misread the whole thing. Before he was a king in the eyes of men, he was already seen. Before a crown ever came near him, he had been anointed in the field. Think about that. He was out where the wool caught thorns, where the wind carried dust into his mouth, where sheep bells knocked softly in the distance. They thought leaving the youngest with the flock made him small, but heaven was watching the one they overlooked. And some of you know that feeling all too well. People built the room, called the names, judged the strength, and never even thought to send for you, until the moment your absence started bothering the purpose of God itself. If this word is already finding you, go ahead and like and subscribe, because the ones who dismissed the shepherd boy had no idea what he had already faced when nobody else was there. And that is where the story turns, because the field was not empty just because people ignored it. You can almost hear it, can't you? The dry grass brushing his ankles, the soft clatter of hooves on stone, the faint animal smell of wool and dust hanging in the afternoon air. While the house was full of taller brothers, cleaner clothes, stronger first impressions, the boy was outside doing the work nobody praises. They thought usefulness without visibility would keep him forgotten. But you need to understand this. Heaven has a way of interrupting rooms that are too confident in what they see. Inside, one son after another stood there, and each looked like the kind of man people trust fast. Broad shoulders, steady posture, the presence that makes a crowd nod before a word is spoken. They thought kingship would arrive dressed in the shape they already respected. But the voice guiding the prophet kept cutting through human judgment. Again and again, what looked impressive was quietly refused. That is a hard word for some of your enemies. They built their whole confidence on appearance, position, and being first in line. They thought being noticed meant being chosen. But with this shepherd, the pattern broke in front of everybody. Then came the uncomfortable question. Is this all of them? Imagine the pause in that room. A father answering, yes, there is one more, the youngest, but he is with the sheep. Listen to that sentence closely. There is one more, but. They thought but would push him to the edge of the story. But that same but became the crack through which destiny stepped into the house. The one treated like an afterthought was suddenly the missing piece no one could move forward without. So they sent for him. They sent for him because the moment of selection had stalled until the overlooked one arrived. And some of you are in that exact season right now. The people who were comfortable without you are about to discover they cannot complete what they started until God brings you in. And when he walks in from the field, smelling like open air and hard work, everything in that room is about to shift. And shift it did. He comes in from the open country, with dust at the hem of his clothes and the smell of sheep still clinging to him. Just a young man pulled out of the workday and into a room that had already judged him before he crossed the doorway. They thought the field had made him unfit for the moment, but the field had made him ready for a moment the room itself could not recognize. You can feel how strange that silence must have been. The older brothers standing there, the father watching, the prophet holding what everyone in the house assumed would go somewhere else. And then the verdict from heaven lands where human pride never would. This one. Not the tallest, or the firstborn, or the obvious choice. The youngest of 8, the one they almost left out, is suddenly standing in the center, while every earlier assumption starts falling apart. That is how God exposes hidden systems. He does not always argue with them out loud. Sometimes he simply chooses the person they arranged their whole structure to ignore. They thought lineage alone would carry the day. But you are watching a different law at work now. The overlooked one becomes the vessel. The dismissed one becomes the turning point. Then the oil is poured. And I want you to stay with that image for a second. The weight of it on his head, the slow line of it running through his hair, the scent of fresh oil in the room, rich and sharp, catching in the air while nobody quite knows what to do with what they are seeing. David is anointed in the field before he is ever seated in public honor, and the room has to sit there and watch heaven crown the one they had assigned to the margins. But here is the part many people miss. The oil changed what was true about him, not what was visible around him. He did not walk out of that house straight into a palace. He walked out carrying a secret that looked unsupported. They thought if the title did not show up immediately, the calling would fade. But real anointing does not expire just because it goes uncelebrated. And before that oil had time to dry, the wilderness was already preparing his next test. And the next test did not come with witnesses, trumpets, or a crown. It came out in the open country, where the light starts to thin and the air changes fast. 1 minute there is the dry smell of grass, the low shifting sound of the flock settling down, the leather strap of a shepherd's sling warm in the hand. And the next minute, something is wrong. The sheep bunch together, heads jerk, hooves scrape dirt. He learned that danger often announces itself by what it does to everything around you first. They thought the lonely places would make him soft with obscurity. But the lonely places were teaching his senses to wake up before fear could speak. This is where hidden adversaries always miscalculate the chosen. They see isolation and assume weakness. They see routine and assume there is no training happening. But while other people were measuring that young man by how little attention he got, he was being built in a place where hesitation could cost a life. He was not out there passing time. He was guarding what had been placed in his care. Then the lion came, not as a story told later around a fire, but as heat and motion and panic in the herd. Feel the jolt of it, dust kicking up, the harsh cry of an animal torn out of calm. That instant when the body knows there is no time to gather a committee, no time to ask who believes in you, no time to look over your shoulder for help. They thought a boy among sheep would break at the first real threat, but he moved toward what everyone else would have run from. And understand the weight of that. The same one people had treated as too small for a room full of brothers was now standing between a predator and the flock with nothing but grit, obedience, and the kind of courage that only shows itself when nobody is clapping. That victory stayed out there in the dust, unwitnessed by the house that had nearly forgotten him. But the field was not finished proving what had been poured on him. Because after the lion, another force rose up, heavier, meaner, and harder to stop, and it did not back off. If the lion was speed and shock, the bear was weight, a different kind of terror. Slower maybe, but heavier, more stubborn, harder to turn once it had decided to come through. Out there, with evening pressing down and the last light going copper across the ground, he met another threat that should have ended the story before anybody in a royal court ever heard his name. They thought one private victory was luck. Heaven was building a pattern in him, and the pattern was this: what came against what was under his care would not be allowed to rule the field. You have to picture the strain of that moment. The flock breaking apart, dust lifting in the air, the raw smell of animal breath, the sting in the hands from grabbing, pulling, holding on when every instinct in the body is screaming that this is too much. He did not have a crowd chanting for him. He did not have soldiers beside him. He did not even have brothers there to finally admit what he carried. He had responsibility and a decision. They thought the youngest would protect himself first, but he stepped into danger for something weaker than he was. That is where hidden enemies keep exposing themselves. They count on selfishness. They assume pressure will make you abandon your assignment. They assume if they hit hard enough, you will drop what God trusted you with just to save your own comfort. But this shepherd had already learned something most powerful people never do. If you cannot be trusted with the small, trembling thing in your care, you are not ready for anything larger. And yes, this was the season when David learned what his own hands could do under the fear of the Lord. In contact, in grit, in that close, breathless struggle where survival comes down to whether heaven has really put courage inside you, or whether you only liked the sound of being chosen. They thought the oil on his head was symbolic, but the field kept proving it had substance. So when he later speaks of the lion and the bear, he is not boasting. He is reaching back to the secret place where God taught him again and again that what looks impossible from a distance feels different when obedience closes the gap. And once those wilderness victories were sealed into him, the next battle would no longer stay hidden in the pasture. It would step out where two armies could see it. And that public moment arrived with noise before it arrived with action. This time, the threat was not hidden in tall grass or dusk. It stood out in the open, where metal flashed in the sun, where dust hung over two waiting armies, where men tightened their grip on weapons they were no longer sure they believed in. The giant shadow fell across the valley long before any blow was struck. And that is how fear often works against the chosen. It tries to win with sound, with spectacle, with repetition. They thought if they made the threat large enough, loud enough, and daily enough, courage would rot inside every heart that heard it. So the challenge kept coming. Day after day, that voice rolled across the field like thunder hitting stone. Mockery, defiance, that cold competence of someone who has never been told no at the edge of battle. Hear the scrape of armor, the deep shout bouncing off the hills, the uneasy shifting in the camp as grown men stared and said nothing. They thought intimidation was enough. They thought the fight was already over because nobody had stepped forward. But silence in a crowd is not proof that truth has lost. Sometimes it only means heaven is waiting on the right person to arrive. And while that valley was filling with dread, David was not there yet to hear the taunts. He was still moving between obedience and obscurity, still carrying the marks of the pasture no one valued enough. That matters. Because the one who would break the fear on that field was not trained first by war councils. He had been trained by responsibility, by hidden tests, by nights when no one knew what he had survived. They thought the answer had to come from the obvious ranks, from the tallest men in armor, from the ones already standing near the king. But help was not rising from where they expected. It was still on the way. And when he finally reaches that battlefield, he will not first notice the size of the enemy. He will notice something far more dangerous: an entire people shrinking back under a voice they should never have agreed to fear. And that is exactly what he saw. He comes into camp with ordinary things in his hands, the smell of bread and grain still on them, dust from the road on his feet, and the sound of anxious men rolling through the valley like a bad wind. Then the shout comes again, harsh, defiant, familiar now to everyone except him. The giant's shadow is not just over the battlefield, it is inside the hearts of the people who have listened too long. They thought one more voice of intimidation would blend into the air like all the others. But this time, the wrong ears heard it. You can feel the shift in him almost immediately. A different reaction rises in him, sharp and clean. He looks at the same threat everybody else sees, but he measures it by a different scale. That is the part hidden adversaries never understand about a person marked by God. They think fear is universal. They think if they speak loudly enough, everyone will agree on what should be impossible. But some of you carry a memory of private victories, and that memory makes public intimidation lose its spell. So while the soldiers keep their distance, he starts asking questions. He wants to know why this voice has been allowed to keep poisoning the atmosphere. He wants to know who this challenger thinks he is, standing there day after day, mocking the living God, while a whole army absorbs the insult like it belongs there. They thought curiosity from a young shepherd would be harmless, but holy outrage is dangerous when it wakes up in the right person. And that is when resistance starts shifting closer to home. His oldest brother hears him speak, and instead of feeling courage, he feels irritation. You know that sting, when the first people to challenge your calling are not always strangers, but those who knew you before the moment changed. He questions the boy's motives. He pushes him back toward the sheep in his words, as if old labels can still hold him. They thought shame would send him retreating to the margins again. But he does not fold. He turns from that accusation, still burning with the same question. And now the camp itself is starting to notice that the one they dismissed is not backing down. And once the camp notices, the murmuring starts to travel. A few words here, a glance there. Then suddenly, the same young man his brother tried to brush aside is being passed from ear to ear until the matter reaches the king. You can almost feel the air in that moment. Tight, stale, heavy with sweat, leather, and nervous waiting. Men who had gone quiet under threats now turn to look at him, as if they cannot decide whether he is brave, naive, or sent into the camp by a mercy they did not ask for. They thought his questions would die in the noise. But when truth speaks without trembling, even fearful people carry it further than they planned. So he is brought in. Without the swagger of a soldier or rank behind him, he comes in carrying the same plainness that has followed him from the hills. And that matters, because hidden powers always trust appearances too much. They thought deliverance had to look official before it could be real. But the one standing there is still shaped by open fields, by long watchfulness, by a life that learned courage before it ever learned ceremony. Then he speaks, and the room changes. He does not deny the size of the threat. He does not pretend the valley is easy. He simply refuses to agree with the fear that is settled over everyone else. And when the king hears that confidence, he pushes back the way frightened authority often does. You are just a youth. That man has been trained for this from his early days. They thought experience alone would settle the argument. But there is a kind of experience people overlook because it happened out of sight. That is when David reaches back into the pasture, not to decorate himself with stories, but to name the training nobody honored when it was happening. He speaks of the lion, then the bear. He speaks of protecting the flock when there was no audience, no reward, no witness except God. The words are simple, but they hit with weight, because now private obedience is standing in the center of public crisis and demanding to be counted. They thought unseen battles did not qualify as preparation, but those hidden rescues had built a certainty in him the camp did not have. And the king is about to offer him something that sounds like help, but carries a trap of its own. And now the offer is on the table. The king's armor sits there, heavy and polished, catching the light, smelling like oil, metal, and another man's confidence. Everybody in that moment thinks it looks like help. They thought covering him in what belonged to someone else would make him safer, stronger, more respectable. But David feels the weight instantly. He moves, he tests it, and the room is about to learn something they never wanted to admit. Borrowed fear still feels like fear, even when it shines. So he takes it off. In clarity, he is refusing confusion. That is what hidden adversaries never understand about a person who knows who he is. They think the right image will change the outcome. They think if you dress the calling in the clothes of the crowd will finally believe it. But the chosen one does not need to look like everyone else to be covered by God. Now the camp is watching him stand there, bare of the king's weight, and that alone is a rebuke. They thought the giant's shadow could be answered only by matching force with force, display with display, fear with fear. But the boy who was anointed in the field is not moving by their rules. He is moving by memory, by faith, by the kind of confidence you only get after surviving things nobody saw. He reaches for what he already trusts, his own hands, his own sling, the same simple obedience that carried him through the pasture when no one was looking. And that is where the real offense begins. Because he is not saying, I have no fear. He is saying, I know what God has already done. They thought the battle would start with noise, but it starts with a decision no one else in the room is brave enough to make. He turns away from the polished gear, the waiting soldiers, the old expectations, and he steps toward the place where 5 smooth stones are waiting in the stream bed. And the king, standing behind him, has no idea yet what that choice is about to unleash. And that choice looks almost too small to matter. He walks down toward the water while the valley still holds its breath. The stream is cool over his fingers, the stones slick and rounded, the sound of moving water strangely calm beside a field loaded with fear. He does not grab at random. He chooses, one by one. 5 smooth stones, each fitting the hand without fighting it. They thought greatness had to arrive covered in noise and iron, but heaven was about to answer spectacle with simplicity. Do not miss how steady he is here. No frantic movement, no trying to become somebody else at the edge of the crisis. The same young man who watched over sheep is now standing beside running water preparing for a giant. And he is not scattered. That matters for you too, because the adversaries that gather around a chosen life love confusion. They thought pressure could make him rush, panic, and reach for whatever looked impressive in the moment. But he moved with the calm of someone who had already settled the battle long before he stepped into public view. Then he rises from the brook with what looks, to everyone else, embarrassingly little: a sling, a staff, stones in a pouch. No heavy sword at his side, no armor clanging on his chest. Just what had already been proven in hidden places. They thought the weapon was too plain, too light, too familiar to matter against a threat this large. But the issue was never whether the tools impressed the crowd. The issue was whether the hand using them had learned obedience in secret. And now he starts forward. Eyes are on him from every direction. Soldiers, commanders, brothers, the king himself. Dust shifts under his feet. Sun catches on distant metal. The air seems stretched thin. He is walking toward mockery, toward a voice that has dominated trained fighters, toward a shape so large it has bent the courage of a nation. They thought the giant's shadow would swallow him before he got close enough to matter. But something else is about to happen first. Because when the challenger sees who is actually coming down the slope to meet him, the valley erupts with a new kind of insult. And the words thrown at this shepherd are meant to crush him before he ever lifts his arm. And the insult comes exactly where fear always tries to land: identity. The giant looks down, sees a youth with a staff, a pouch, and a shepherd's sling, and the mockery spills out fast. To that towering warrior, this is an offense. He expected armor, ranks, ceremony, somebody who looked like a proper answer. Instead, he sees the one heaven chose walking toward him without the costume of power, and he laughs. They thought ridicule would do what steel had not done yet. They thought if they could make him feel small, he would finally agree with their version of him. But the young man does not answer from insecurity. That is the turning point. When somebody has survived hidden tests with God, public insults lose some of their poison. He has already been underestimated by family, overlooked in the house, shaped in lonely places, and proven in the field. So now, in the valley, the taunts do not define him. They reveal the blindness of the one speaking. The mockery is loud, but it is empty. They thought shame could shake his center. But there are moments when the chosen stop reacting to what people call them and start speaking from what heaven has already confirmed. So he answers, without panic or a desperate attempt to sound fierce. He names the difference between them. One comes wrapped in weapons. The other comes in the name of the Lord. And you can hear how bold that sounds when everything around him is still trembling. Dust drifting, shields glinting, soldiers frozen on both ridges, a whole valley listening, while a shepherd dares to speak as if the outcome has already been decided. They thought confidence belonged to the bigger man. But confidence rooted in God does not need height to stand tall. This is why the moment matters to you. Because some battles are won before the first strike, when you stop borrowing the enemy's language about your limits. He does not repeat the giant's measurements. He does not debate whether the threat looks too large. He declares what the field is actually for, that the Lord saves in a way human strength does not control. They thought their system of size, fear, and public pressure would rule the day. But now, the words are finished, and the next sound the valley hears will not be another insult. It will be movement. And then he moves first, forward, not backward or sideways. That matters more than people think, because the valley had been trained by fear to expect retreat. The giant had spoken so long, so loudly, that everybody assumed the smaller man would hesitate once the distance closed. They thought motion itself belonged to the stronger side. But the one with the sling breaks that agreement in an instant. Dust kicks under his feet. The pouch strikes lightly against his side. His breath stays measured. And all at once, the field is no longer ruled by the enemy's timing. You can almost hear the sudden change in sound. The crowd stops murmuring. Armor settles. Even the wind feels like it is waiting. He reaches into the bag, fingers closing around one stone from the 5 smooth stones he had chosen by the water. And there is no wasted movement in him. That is what hidden adversaries hate most. Not just courage, but clarity. They thought pressure would make him clumsy, but the same hand that guarded the flock knows exactly what to do now. And while the larger man comes on with insult still hot on his lips, the shepherd's sling begins to turn. Leather hums through the air. One circle, then another. Clean, controlled, familiar. This is not a trick pulled out for drama. This is practiced obedience meeting its public hour. They thought the tool was too plain to matter. They thought only complicated strength could answer a threat this large. But heaven has always enjoyed using what the proud dismiss. Then comes that split second no one in either army can call back. The release. A single stone leaves his hand and cuts through the open space between them. No storm of arrows, no clash of blades, just one small thing moving with terrifying precision toward the place God has appointed. And that is the mystery some of your enemies still cannot stand. When God decides the moment has come, it does not take much to break what has intimidated people for years. The stone finds the forehead. The forehead, not the shield or the armor. The part everyone could see. The part lifted high in defiance. And in that stunned heartbeat, before the body even finishes falling, 2 armies are forced to witness the collapse of a confidence they had treated like untouchable. And the silence that follows is about to say more than all the shouting ever did. And that silence is its own kind of thunder. For one stunned moment, the whole valley forgets how to breathe. The giant shadow, which had stretched over everyone for so long, is broken in a single instant, and nobody knows what to do with that kind of reversal. The small sounds return, a loose strap hitting armor, a foot shifting in gravel, somebody inhaling too fast. They thought fear had become permanent, but all at once, the thing that ruled the atmosphere is lying still in the dust, and 2 armies are forced to look at what happens when God answers in public. Then the spell breaks. The camp that had frozen starts moving. The enemy line, which had leaned so hard on one man's presence, begins to come apart. This is the secret hidden powers never want exposed. Their strength is often concentrated in an image, a threat, a voice people agreed not to challenge. Remove that, and the whole structure starts shaking. They thought one champion made them untouchable, but when the shepherd's obedience lands, panic changes sides. And right in the center of that reversal stands the young man who was never supposed to matter. Without royal armor or status, just the same one they underestimated, now impossible to dismiss. The field has answered the room. The pasture has answered the camp. The one who was overlooked by his own household has become the reason an entire nation can breathe again. And if you have ever been pushed to the edges and treated like an afterthought, you know why this moment hits so hard. They thought if they kept you out of the center long enough, you would never shape the outcome. But God has a way of bringing the ignored person into the exact hour that exposes everybody's blindness. But stay with me, because victory creates witnesses, and witnesses create reactions. Some look at what just happened and feel courage wake up in them. Others look at the very same moment and feel something darker begin to stir. Admiration in one heart, resentment in another. Relief in one man, insecurity in the next. They thought the battle ended when the giant fell. It did not. Because the same public triumph that lifted his name in the ears of the people was about to trouble the heart of a king. And that trouble does not announce itself with open hatred at first. It starts in the quieter places, in the look that lingers too long, in the praise that lands on the wrong ears, in the way a victory song can feel sweet to one person and threatening to another. The king hears what the people are saying, hears the rise of the shepherd's name, and something inside him tightens instead of rejoices. They thought public honor would secure his place. But when insecurity sits on a throne, even loyalty can start to look like a rival. This is one of the hardest lessons in the whole story. Not every enemy meets you in a valley with armor on. Some adversaries sit close. Some smile first. Some benefit from your courage until they realize your obedience exposes their fear. And the one who felled the giant is now stepping into a more confusing battle, because this next danger does not come from a stranger across the field. It comes from a leader who should have felt relief, but feels threatened instead. You can almost sense the change in the room. Music still plays, voices still move through the court. Lamps burn low, throwing warm light on walls and polished wood. But under that surface, the air has shifted. The same man who once offered armor now watches the young victor through narrowed thoughts. They thought the battle was over because the public crisis had been solved. But hidden hostility is often born right after visible triumph. And this is where your spirit has to stay awake. Because David does not become less chosen when the atmosphere turns strange. He does not lose what was poured on him just because a powerful man cannot process what God is doing. The oil still speaks, even when favor in the room starts drying up. They thought proximity to power would protect him now. But God would show him something deeper. You can be anointed and still be misunderstood, celebrated by the crowd and targeted in private, honored one day and hunted the next. That is the turn. The shepherd who had stood in the open is about to learn what it means to survive under a suspicious eye, and the path ahead will not lead straight to the throne. It will bend through tension, through pursuit, through nights with stone under his back instead of royal comfort. And when the caves open their mouths to receive him, many will assume the promise has failed. And this is where the hidden years start doing their real work. Inside the caves, the world changes shape. Cold stone under his back, damp air that smells like earth and old rain, water dripping somewhere in the dark, slow and stubborn, like time refusing to rush. They thought isolation would shrink him. They thought the hunted life would make him bitter, careless, easy to break. But the same one who was anointed in the field is learning how to stand steady when no throne is in sight. That is the part people miss about his wilderness season. It was not empty. It was crowded, with pressure, with silence, with waiting, with the kind of decisions that nobody applauds. He learned to hold back when he could have struck. He learned to breathe when fear wanted to turn him reckless. He learned to keep his heart clean in a place that would have made other men hard. They thought the caves were a punishment, but the caves were training him to carry power without becoming poisoned by it. And if you are watching closely, you can see the transformation. The boy from the pasture, the one with a shepherd's sling and a simple trust, is becoming something the hunters around him do not know how to measure. Sharper, deeper. Hidden enemies always want you to believe delay means defeat. But delay can be the forge where obedience gets burned into your bones. David is not just surviving in those shadows. He is learning how to worship there, how to pray when the ceiling is stone, how to listen when every sound is small, how to keep his mind from being ruled by the men chasing him. That is why the wilderness cannot finish him. It can strip him, yes. It can empty him of comfort, but it cannot empty him of purpose. The same God who met him among sheep and stones is still meeting him here, in dust and echo and long nights. They thought being hunted would erase the promise, but promises do not die just because the road gets rough. Sometimes they get tested in places nobody wants to visit. And that testing is making him into a man his enemies will not recognize when he finally steps back into the light. Because the next person to find him in the dark is not coming by accident. And the ones who find him there are not the polished, easy people you would expect. They come carrying strain in their faces and wear in their voices. Men pressed by debt, by grief, by disappointment, by a life that has already knocked the shine off them. In the cave air, with smoke hanging low and rough hands warming near small fires, they gather around the hunted man. They thought the wilderness would leave him abandoned, but the wilderness starts turning into a place of assembly. That is a reversal your enemies never plan for. They assume pressure will scatter your future. They assume hardship will make people avoid you. They assume a cave means you have been reduced to less. But with him, the opposite begins to happen. Those who are bruised start recognizing strength in the one still standing. Those who are tired find clarity near someone whose purpose has not died in the dark. They thought his years of hiding had made him irrelevant, but even there, leadership begins to form around him like a quiet fire catching. And notice this, he is not leading from comfort. No throne behind him, no banner overhead, no official title in the eyes of men that secures the moment. Just stone walls, restless sleep, scarce supplies, long uncertainty. And yet, people begin to trust him. That tells you something deep about what was being built in him. Real authority does not wait for furniture, ceremony, or public approval. It shows up where others feel lost and gives them a reason to keep moving. This is why the cave matters so much. It is not just where he hid. It is where he learned how to carry wounded people without using them, how to steady discouraged hearts while his own future still looked unresolved, how to become a covering for others while he himself was still exposed. They thought he needed a palace before he could become a king. But heaven proved the opposite. If he could shepherd broken men in darkness, he could one day carry a nation in the light. And yet, the pressure does not ease. The hunter on the throne is still searching. The path is still narrow. The dust of the wilderness still clings to his feet. And soon, in one of those tight, dangerous moments, the pursued man will find himself closer to the one chasing him than anyone would have believed possible, with a decision in his hands that could change everything. And that impossible closeness becomes its own test. The man hunting him steps into the same region of stone and shadow where he is hiding, unaware of just how near he has come. You can feel the tension in that cave. Stale air, the scrape of cloth against rock, the hush of men trying not to breathe too loudly. Every eye turns toward the pursued one. Every hand tightens. They thought this was the moment to settle everything in one stroke. They thought if power had finally walked within reach, taking it would be wisdom. But that is not how he moves. This is where the wilderness reveals what it has really built in him. Anybody can look strong when striking back feels easy. Not everybody can stand inside a perfect opportunity for revenge and still answer to God before answering to emotion. Hidden adversaries always expect you to become a mirror of the harm done to you. They thought years of pressure, betrayal, and pursuit would harden him into the same kind of man that chased him. But the cave exposes the difference between surviving pain and being ruled by it. So he restrains his hand. He is neither weak nor afraid, because he understands something the men around him do not fully grasp yet. If the promise came from God, he does not need to force it into being through anger. That is a terrifying truth for every enemy built on manipulation. They thought delay would make him desperate, but delay has made him disciplined. And still, he does not leave the moment untouched. He takes only enough to make the truth undeniable later, enough to prove how close the king came, enough to show that his life was spared not by blindness, but by mercy. In the dimness of that cave, with the smell of dust and worn leather all around, he chooses a sign over a strike. That choice says more about his authority than a quick act of payback ever could. Because this is the deeper victory, and some of you need to hear it. Winning is not always destroying the person who cornered you. Sometimes, winning is refusing to let their chaos rewrite who you are. They thought they could drag him down into the same hunger for control that ruled them. But even in hiding, even under threat, he stays aligned with something cleaner, higher, harder to corrupt. And when he finally steps out and calls after the king, holding proof in his hand, the hunted man is about to become the mirror his pursuer cannot avoid. And when he calls out, the wilderness itself seems to listen. His voice travels over stone and open air, not sharp with revenge, but clear enough to stop a king in his tracks. In his hand is the proof, a piece taken from the robe of the man who came hunting him, a torn edge. That is what makes the moment so devastating. They thought power could chase him into becoming cruel. But the hunted man stands at a distance and answers violence with restraint so undeniable that even his enemy has to face it. You can picture it. The morning light spreading thin across rock, dust resting on sandals, men on both sides frozen by what has just been revealed. The ruler looks down at the missing piece, then up at the one who spared him, and all the noise that had driven the years of pursuit begins to crack. Hidden adversaries always believe control will protect their image, but mercy has a way of exposing them more completely than force ever could. And there, in that raw open space between cave and crown, the truth lands. The shepherd boy they overlooked, the young man who faced lion and bear with bare hands, the one who refused borrowed armor, chose one stone, and watched a giant collapse before two armies. The fugitive sleeping on stone after being anointed long before the throne ever opened. He was never abandoned. David was being formed in every place that looked like delay. They thought the caves proved the promise had failed, but the cave had only sharpened the man who came out of it. That torn piece of cloth says everything. A robe can rip in a second. Applause can turn. Armies can tremble. Titles can shake in frightened hands. But what God threads into a life in secret does not fray just because the road runs through dust and dark. For a moment, the hard ground between them holds something almost holier than victory: recognition. Not a crown lowered onto a head, not a parade, just daylight touching a ragged strip of royal fabric, while the pursued man stands taller than the throne that chased him. Then the wind moves through the mouth of the cave, cool and steady, lifting the hem of his garment as the first birds begin to stir somewhere beyond the rocks. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more like it, and leave a comment with the moment that struck you most.